Dr. Heinrich Volker was considered a miracle worker in 1789 Vienna. At 35, he had revolutionized surgical techniques, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of every medical institution in Europe. His colleagues called him a genius. His patients called him a savior. But on March 14th, when his wife Margaret died screaming during a complicated childbirth, something inside Heinrich Volker didn't just break. It transformed into something far more dangerous than grief. The baby died too. Heinrich held both bodies for 6 hours, refusing to let the midwives take them. When they finally pried Margaret from his arms, witnesses reported that he didn't cry. He just stared at her face with an expression they couldn't quite identify. Later they would realize it wasn't grief they saw, it was calculation. Heinrich became obsessed with a singular idea that consumed every waking moment. What if death wasn't final? His medical training had taught him about blood circulation, organ function, tissue regeneration. He had seen wounds heal, skin regrow, bones mend. If the body could repair itself while alive, what stopped it from repairing itself after death? The answer, he decided, was simple: fresh blood, young blood, blood untouched by disease or age. He started innocently enough, or so he told himself. He convinced a local orphanage that he was conducting research on childhood illnesses. The administrators, desperate for funding and impressed by his reputation, gave him unlimited access to their charges. Heinrich would examine the children, taking detailed notes about their health, their vigor, their innocence. He measured their pulses, studied their blood under primitive microscopes, and became convinced he had found his answer. The healthiest children, he observed, had blood that seemed almost luminescent under magnification. Their young hearts pumped with a strength that adults had lost. This wasn't just blood. This was life itself, concentrated and pure. And if he could extract that life, transfer it, inject it into dead tissue, perhaps he could reverse what God himself had declared permanent. But Heinrich's colleagues praised his dedication to pediatric medicine. They had no idea that every examination was reconnaissance, every measurement was preparation. The medical community celebrated him while he planned something that would make medieval torturers seem merciful. 3 months after Margaret's death, Heinrich did something that should have raised immediate alarm but didn't. He had her body moved from the church cemetery to a private mausoleum he'd constructed on his estate. He told everyone it was a monument to his eternal love. He even invited colleagues to view the elaborate marble structure. They admired his devotion. They didn't know that beneath the decorative exterior, Heinrich had built something else entirely, a laboratory. And in that laboratory, Margaret's body lay not in a sealed coffin, but on an examination table, waiting. The first injections were crude. He extracted blood from laboratory rats and injected it into Margaret's decomposing veins. Nothing happened, of course, except accelerated putrefaction. Animal blood was too different, too primitive. He needed something closer to human. Something young, something pure. That's when Heinrich made a decision that would damn him forever. Children weren't just subjects for study anymore. They were resources, raw materials, the very essence he needed to bring Margaret back. And the truly horrifying part? Nobody suspected a thing. Dr. Heinrich Volker was still Vienna's most respected physician, still a man of science and reason, still invited to the finest homes and consulted by the wealthiest families. His descent into absolute monstrosity was just beginning, and the entire city was helping him do it. 9-year-old Thomas Adler was the son of Heinrich's housekeeper, Maria. The boy had been coming to the Volker estate for years, playing in the gardens while his mother worked. He was healthy, energetic, with rosy cheeks that seemed to glow with vitality. Heinrich had watched him for months, taking mental notes, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a Tuesday evening in June 1789. Maria had asked Heinrich if Thomas could stay overnight because she needed to visit her sick sister in the next town. Heinrich agreed with a warmth that made Maria's heart swell with gratitude. She had no idea she had just delivered her son into the hands of something wearing her employer's face. Thomas fell asleep in one of the guest rooms around 9 o'clock. By midnight, Heinrich had carried the unconscious boy down to the laboratory beneath the mausoleum. He had sedated Thomas with laudanum mixed into warm milk, a common practice for restless children. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would raise questions if discovered. What happened next defied every principle of medicine Heinrich had ever learned. He strapped Thomas to a surgical table designed for adults, leaving the small body looking even more fragile against the leather restraints. Heinrich had prepared meticulously. Glass tubes, needles of various sizes, collection vessels. And in the adjacent chamber, Margaret's body, now 4 months dead, preserved as well as 18th century techniques allowed. Heinrich's hands didn't shake as he made the first incision into Thomas's arm. He told himself this was necessary, scientific, a breakthrough that would revolutionize medicine and cheat death itself. The boy's blood flowed dark and rich into the collection vessel. Heinrich watched it with an expression that witnesses would later describe as religious ecstasy. But extracting blood wasn't enough. Heinrich had convinced himself that specific organs held concentrated life force. The liver, he believed, filtered and purified blood, making it the seat of vitality. The kidneys cleansed and renewed. The heart, obviously, was the engine of life itself. If he could transplant these organs, or at least extract their essence, he could accomplish what no one had dared attempt. Thomas woke up during the third extraction. The laudanum had worn off faster than Heinrich expected. The boy's screams echoed through the laboratory until Heinrich administered more sedative. But the damage was visible. Thomas's small body bore incisions across his abdomen, his arms, his legs. Heinrich had been systematic, almost surgical in his butchery. He had extracted enough blood to fill 3 large vessels. He had removed a portion of Thomas's liver. He had taken 1 kidney entirely. The truly sickening part was that Heinrich kept the boy alive through it all. His medical expertise, the same skills that had saved hundreds of lives, now served a darker purpose. He sutured wounds with precision. He managed the bleeding. He kept Thomas's vital signs stable, even as he systematically dismantled the child's body. When Maria returned the next morning, she found Thomas in his bed, pale and feverish, but alive. Heinrich explained that the boy had fallen ill during the night. Food poisoning, perhaps. Nothing serious, but Thomas needed rest. Maria, grateful for Heinrich's care, never thought to examine her son's body beneath his nightshirt. She never saw the crude stitches, the bandages hidden under loose clothing, the way Thomas flinched at any touch. Heinrich gave Maria a substantial sum of money. For the inconvenience, he said. For her troubles. And for her silence, though he didn't say that part. Maria, poor and desperate, accepted. She took Thomas home, and Heinrich made it clear that the best medical care would be available if she remained discreet about her son's illness. Thomas survived, but he was never the same. He stopped speaking entirely. He developed a permanent limp. His eyes held a 1,000-yard stare that Maria couldn't understand. When she tried to ask Heinrich what had really happened, he suggested that trauma sometimes affected children's minds. Perhaps Thomas had witnessed something disturbing. Perhaps it was better not to press him for details. Perhaps some things were better left forgotten. Maria, terrified and confused, accepted this explanation because the alternative was too horrible to consider. Dr. Heinrich Volker was a respected man, a pillar of the community. Surely he wouldn't harm a child. But Thomas knew the truth. And in his nightmares, he saw Dr. Volker's face hovering above him, not with malice, but with something worse. Scientific curiosity. The expression of a man who had stopped seeing children as human beings and started seeing them as components, as materials, as the price of resurrection. And the most disturbing detail? It had worked, partially at least. Heinrich had injected Thomas's blood directly into Margaret's preserved body. For 3 days, there had been changes. Color returned to her skin, however briefly. Her tissues seemed less rigid. Her decomposition slowed noticeably. It wasn't resurrection, But it was something. Proof of concept. Validation of his theory. Which meant Heinrich needed more. Much more. Thomas Adler had been a test run, a proof that his methods had merit. But one child's essence wasn't enough to truly revive Margaret. Heinrich calculated that he would need at least a dozen more subjects, maybe 20. Children healthy enough, young enough, pure enough to provide the concentrated life force his wife required. The city of Vienna had thousands of poor children, orphans, street urchins, forgotten sons and daughters of desperate families. And Dr. Heinrich Volker had just discovered that his reputation made him untouchable. He could continue his work without fear of discovery. After all, who would suspect a respected physician of mutilating children to revive his dead wife? The nightmare was just beginning. And Thomas Adler, still alive but forever broken, was only the first victim of Heinrich's descending madness. Over the following 18 months, 12 more children disappeared from Vienna's poorest districts. Not all at once, never in patterns that would draw attention. Heinrich had become methodical in his selection process, choosing victims whose absence wouldn't trigger immediate investigations. Orphans with no family, children of prostitutes, street beggars whom society had already forgotten. Each abduction followed a similar script. Heinrich would approach desperate parents or orphanage administrators with offers of employment, medical treatment, or educational opportunities. His reputation opened every door. Who would refuse Dr. Volker? Who would question his generosity? He promised these children better lives, and in a twisted way, he believed he was offering them purpose. They would contribute to something greater than their miserable existences. They would help resurrect an angel. The laboratory beneath the mausoleum had evolved into something that would have horrified even the most hardened anatomist. Heinrich had installed better equipment. Gas lamps provided constant illumination. He had acquired surgical tools from across Europe. Restraining tables of various sizes accommodated children from toddlers to adolescents. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with specimens preserved in alcohol, small organs, tissue samples, vials of blood labeled with dates and names that meant nothing to anyone but Heinrich. His procedure had become refined through brutal repetition. He would sedate the children first, a mercy he convinced himself made him humane. Then came the extractions. Blood first, always blood. He had determined that children between ages 7 and 12 provided the optimal vitality. Younger children had insufficient volume. Older children's blood had already begun losing its purity. But Heinrich's obsession had grown beyond simple transfusions. He had started believing that specific organs from specific children served different purposes. A musically gifted child's brain matter might restore Margaret's cognitive functions. An athletic boy's heart tissue could strengthen her cardiovascular system. A beautiful girl's skin might replace Margaret's decomposing exterior. He kept meticulous records of everything. Leather-bound journals filled with observations written in a cramped, increasingly erratic hand. Each entry detailed the child's name, age, physical characteristics, and what Heinrich had extracted. He noted the time of procedures, Margaret's responses, and calculations for future experiments. These journals read like nightmare fuel. Clinical descriptions of unspeakable acts, written with the detached precision of scientific inquiry. The truly disturbing part was how normal Heinrich appeared in public. He still attended medical conferences. He still treated wealthy patients. He published papers on surgical innovations that made his colleagues applaud his genius. Nobody noticed the dark circles under his eyes. Nobody questioned why he spent so many nights at his estate. His grief over Margaret's death was well known. His isolation seemed natural for a widower. Between procedures, Heinrich would spend hours in Margaret's chamber. He had moved her from the examination table to an elaborate bed surrounded by flowers that he replaced daily. The flowers masked the smell of decay that even his preservation techniques couldn't completely eliminate. He would sit beside her, holding her cold hand, talking to her about his progress. These one-sided conversations had started rationally enough. Heinrich would describe his experiments, his findings, his theories. But as months passed, the conversations changed. He started believing she was responding. A slight movement of her fingers that was actually rigor mortis settling. a change in her expression that was actually flesh decomposing. Heinrich interpreted every natural process of death as signs of returning life. He began dressing Margaret in her favorite gowns, doing her hair, applying rouge to her gray cheeks. From a distance, in the laboratory's dim lighting, she almost looked alive. Up close, the horror was undeniable. Her skin had taken on a waxy quality. Her eyes had sunken into their sockets. Her mouth hung permanently open despite Heinrich's attempts to wire it shut. The body was a grotesque parody of the woman she had been. But Heinrich's deteriorating mind refused to acknowledge reality. He convinced himself that each new injection brought her closer to resurrection. When her skin showed more color, he celebrated breakthrough. When her body temperature rose slightly from the warm blood injections, he documented it as proof of returning circulation. He was a scientist observing facts, not a madman mutilating children to animate a corpse. The children who survived his procedures carried permanent damage. Those he released back to their families or orphanages bore scars both physical and psychological. Most stopped speaking. Some developed seizures from brain tissue extractions. Others died weeks later from infections or organ failure. But Heinrich had calculated this into his work. Child mortality was high in Vienna anyway. A few more dead children from mysterious illnesses wouldn't raise suspicions. He had even developed a system for disposal. Children who died during procedures were dismembered and buried in the estate's extensive grounds. Heinrich personally dug each grave at night, treating it like sacred work. He marked the locations in his journals, but nowhere else. The gardens above these burial sites grew with unusual vigor, fed by the decomposing bodies below. By month 18, Heinrich had convinced himself that Margaret was nearly alive. She was warmer to the touch. Her tissues seemed more supple. Her face had regained some color. None of this was resurrection. It was simply fresh blood and tissue injected into a dead body, creating the temporary illusion of life before inevitable decay resumed. But Heinrich's obsession had long since devoured his rationality. He started making plans for Margaret's awakening. He bought new dresses for her. He had servants prepare her favorite meals, which sat untouched on trays beside her bed until they rotted. He commissioned a portrait artist to paint her, telling the confused painter to capture her as she appeared now. The resulting painting showed a corpse in formal dress, and the artist left both disturbed and well paid for his silence. Vienna's medical community continued celebrating Dr. Volker's contributions to science. They had no idea that their colleague was conducting experiments that made medieval torture chambers seem merciful. They didn't know that Vienna's poorest children were disappearing into a mausoleum and emerging as spare parts for a dead woman. They couldn't imagine that one of their own had crossed a line so fundamental that there could be no return. But Heinrich's carefully constructed world was developing cracks. Some of the families whose children had vanished were starting to ask questions. Why had Dr. Volker taken their children? Where were they now? The stories he had provided about educational opportunities or medical treatments were wearing thin. People were beginning to whisper. Not accusations yet, but concerns, doubts, the kind of quiet suspicions that eventually grow into investigations. Heinrich noticed none of this. He was too focused on his work, too consumed by his obsession. He had reached the point where Margaret was more real to him than the living people around him. She was his wife, his purpose, his entire reason for existence. And he was convinced that one more procedure, one more perfect child, one more extraction would finally bring her back. By the spring of 1791, Heinrich Volker had stopped pretending to be sane. Not in public, where he still maintained his reputation and charm, but in the privacy of his estate, where the boundaries between science and madness had dissolved entirely. He no longer saw himself as a physician conducting experiments. He had become a prophet, pursuing divine work. The mausoleum laboratory had transformed into something resembling a shrine. Candles burned constantly around Margaret's bed. Heinrich had covered the walls with anatomical drawings, biblical verses about resurrection, and his own increasingly illegible notes. He had started mixing Christian symbolism with medical procedures, convincing himself that science and faith were converging in his work. Margaret's body, had become something that defied description. 23 children had contributed to her restoration by this point. Heinrich had replaced decomposed organs with fresh ones, grafted new skin over rotted tissue, and injected so much blood that her veins had burst and needed repair. The result was a patchwork horror that bore only superficial resemblance to the woman she had been. But in Heinrich's deteriorating perception, she was beautiful, perfect, nearly alive. He had started performing daily rituals that went far beyond medical procedures. He would wash her body with water infused with herbs. He would massage her limbs to maintain flexibility. He would spend hours examining her for signs of life, interpreting every natural decomposition process as evidence of returning vitality. The most disturbing development was that Heinrich had started treating Margaret as if she were conscious. He would ask her questions and then wait for responses that never came. He would tell her about his day and laugh at jokes only he could hear. He ate meals beside her bed, setting a place for her and occasionally putting food to her decomposed lips. Servants who glimpsed these scenes through doorways left the estate's employment without notice. Heinrich's selection of victims had become less calculated and more desperate. He no longer chose carefully or planned elaborately. He needed children constantly now, convinced that Margaret required regular treatments to maintain her progress. He had stopped releasing survivors. The risk of exposure was too great. Instead, he kept them in cells beneath the laboratory, using them repeatedly until their small bodies could give no more. 6 children were imprisoned in the estate at any given time. Heinrich had converted wine cellar storage rooms into crude holding cells. He fed them minimally, kept them sedated most of the time, and extracted what he needed on a rotating schedule. Some children survived weeks in these conditions. Others died quickly from shock, infection, or blood loss. Heinrich viewed their deaths as unfortunate but necessary sacrifices. The children who remained conscious enough to understand their situation existed in a nightmare beyond imagination. They were alone in darkness, in constant pain, waiting for the next time Dr. Volker would come with his tools and his gentle voice explaining what he needed to take from them. Some children prayed, others screamed until their voices gave out, most simply dissociated, their minds retreating to places where the horror couldn't reach them. Heinrich had started experiencing hallucinations. He would see Margaret walking through the estate, hear her voice calling his name, feel her touch on his shoulder. These visions felt more real than actual reality. He would follow phantom Margareths through empty rooms, having conversations with air, reaching for hands that weren't there. His servants watched this behavior with growing alarm, but said nothing. Dr. Volker's wealth and reputation still protected him. His medical practice had essentially stopped. Patients who arrived at his office found him distracted, incoherent, or absent entirely. Colleagues who visited the estate noted his disheveled appearance, his rambling speech, his obsessive focus on his late wife. But they attributed this to grief, not madness. They certainly never imagined the truth. The breaking point came when Heinrich decided that Margaret needed a complete heart transplant. Her preserved heart had deteriorated beyond repair, he convinced himself. He needed a fresh one, young, strong, perfect, and he knew exactly where to find it. Elsa Braun was the 11-year-old daughter of a colleague. Heinrich had known her since birth. She was healthy, intelligent, and completely trusting of the kind doctor who sometimes gave her sweets. Heinrich invited her to visit the estate, telling her parents he wanted to show her his medical library. They agreed enthusiastically, honored that the great Dr. Volker would take such interest in their daughter's education. Elsa never returned home. Heinrich performed the extraction with the same clinical precision he had developed over 2 years of practice. Elsa's heart was perfect, young and strong, exactly what Margaret needed. He implanted it in Margaret's chest cavity, connecting vessels with surgical thread, believing that this final piece would complete the resurrection. For 3 days, Heinrich genuinely believed it had worked. Margaret's chest showed warmth from the freshly implanted heart. Her skin color improved from the residual blood. Heinrich interpreted these temporary effects as proof of life returning. He spent 72 hours beside her bed, talking to her constantly, waiting for her eyes to open, convinced that at any moment she would wake up and recognize him. But Elsa's heart, deprived of circulation and proper connection, simply decomposed inside Margaret's chest cavity. The warmth Heinrich felt was infection setting in. The color was gases building up beneath the skin. By the fourth day, the smell was overwhelming. Margaret's body had begun actively rotting from the inside out, the fresh tissue accelerating decay rather than preventing it. Heinrich refused to accept what was happening. He increased the treatments, extracting from the imprisoned children at a frantic pace. He injected Margaret with so much blood that it leaked from her pores. He replaced more organs, grafted more skin, sutured more tissue. The body on his table had become a grotesque assemblage of parts from 24 children, held together by surgical thread and delusion. His servants finally understood that something terrible was happening. They heard children crying in the cellars. They smelled death emanating from the mausoleum. They watched their employer descend into obvious madness. But who would believe them? Who would accept that Vienna's most respected physician was mutilating children in an attempt to resurrect his dead wife? The answer came from an unexpected source. A young medical apprentice named Johann Kreis had been Heinrich's student. Johann admired Heinrich's earlier work and requested permission to visit the estate and observe current research. Heinrich, in his deteriorating mental state, agreed without considering the consequences. What Johann discovered in the mausoleum laboratory would haunt him for the rest of his life. The imprisoned children, the journals documenting unspeakable procedures, and in the center of it all, Dr. Heinrich Volker sitting beside a decomposing corpse, decorated with parts from murdered children, talking to it like it was alive, planning the next extraction that would finally, surely, absolutely, bring her back. Johann ran from the estate and went directly to the authorities. But even as he told his story, even as he begged them to investigate immediately, he knew the horror was far from over. Dr. Volker's reputation was powerful. His connections were extensive. And somewhere in that mausoleum, children were still alive, still imprisoned, still waiting for the next time their captor needed what remained of their bodies to feed his impossible dream. The Vienna police approached the Volker estate on May 3, 1791, with considerable reluctance. Dr. Heinrich Volker was a man of standing, a pillar of the medical community. The accusations brought by Johann Kreis seemed impossible, the ravings of a jealous student or a disturbed mind. But the apprentice's terror had been genuine, his descriptions too detailed to dismiss entirely. The authorities decided to investigate, expecting to find nothing more than an eccentric grieving widower. What they discovered instead would become one of the most horrifying cases in Vienna's history. The first indication that something was catastrophically wrong came from the smell. As officers approached the mausoleum, a stench rolled out that made several men vomit immediately. It wasn't just decay, it was something worse. The accumulated rot of dozens of procedures, preserved organs, decomposing tissue, and human waste from imprisoned children created an atmosphere so toxic that officers had to cover their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar just to approach the entrance. Heinrich met them at the mausoleum door. He was barefoot, wearing a blood-stained surgical gown, his hair wild and uncombed. His eyes held the glazed quality of someone who hadn't slept in days. When the lead officer explained they needed to search the premises, Heinrich smiled with genuine confusion. Search for what? Everything here was medical research, perfectly legitimate. He was a doctor, after all. Didn't they know who he was? The officers pushed past him. What they found in the first chamber stopped them cold. 6 children were chained in the converted wine cellar, ages ranging from 6 to 13. All were emaciated, covered in surgical wounds in various stages of infection. 2 were unconscious. 1 was clearly dying, her breathing shallow and irregular. The others stared at the officers with eyes that had stopped registering hope. They didn't even cry when they saw the police. They had gone beyond that. One officer started freeing the children while others explored deeper into the laboratory. Each new room revealed worse horrors. Examination tables with restraints sized for small bodies. Shelves of glass jars containing organs floating in preservative fluid, labeled with names and dates. Surgical tools stained with old blood. Heinrich's journals, page after page, documenting procedures that read like systematic torture disguised as medical experimentation. But nothing prepared them for the final chamber where Margareta lay. The body on the bed was so grotesquely modified that officers initially couldn't determine what they were looking at. Margaret's original form was barely recognizable beneath the patchwork of grafted skin, sutured organs, and injected tissues. Her chest cavity had been repeatedly opened and closed, leaving thick scars. Her face showed different skin tones where Heinrich had replaced decomposed tissue. Her hands were from different children, one noticeably larger than the other. The fresh heart in her chest was visible through a surgical window Heinrich had created, rotting in plain view. The smell was indescribable. Despite Heinrich's preservation efforts, the body was actively decomposing. Maggots crawled through surgical incisions. Fluids leaked from poorly sutured wounds. The bed beneath her was stained with the discharge of putrefaction. This wasn't a preserved body. It was an abomination that nature was trying desperately to reclaim. Heinrich followed the officers into the chamber, completely unaware of their horror. He spoke about Margaret with scientific enthusiasm, explaining his procedures, his theories, his progress. She was almost ready to wake up, he told them. Just one more treatment, maybe two. He had refined the technique significantly. Would they like to see his notes? He could prove that resurrection was scientifically achievable. The officers stared at this man, this respected physician, calmly discussing the mutilation of children as if it were a legitimate medical breakthrough. One officer, a father of 3, couldn't contain himself. He grabbed Heinrich and threw him against the wall, screaming about the children, the murdered innocents, the monster wearing a doctor's coat. Heinrich seemed genuinely confused by the anger. Couldn't they see he was close to a breakthrough? Didn't they understand the implications for medical science? The search of the estate grounds revealed 11 burial sites, small graves scattered throughout the gardens, each containing the dismembered remains of children who hadn't survived Heinrich's procedures. Some bodies showed signs of multiple extractions. Others were missing so many organs and limbs that identification would prove impossible. The youngest victim appeared to be around 4 years old, the oldest maybe 14. As word spread through Vienna, crowds gathered outside the estate. Parents of missing children arrived, desperate for information. Medical colleagues appeared, unable to believe the accusations against their esteemed peer. Journalists documented every detail. The story was too sensational, too horrible to ignore. Vienna's most respected physician had been conducting experiments that made medieval torture seem civilized. The surviving children were taken to a hospital, but the physical damage was only part of their trauma. Most never spoke again. Several died within weeks from infections or organ failure. Those who survived carried scars that no surgery could repair. They became living evidence of what happens when scientific curiosity detaches completely from human empathy. Heinrich was arrested without resistance. He seemed more annoyed by the interruption than concerned about the charges. Even in custody, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. He was a scientist. Scientists conducted experiments. He had maintained detailed records. He had followed proper procedures. The only difference was that his research aimed higher than anyone else's. He was trying to conquer death itself. Surely they could appreciate the significance of that goal. During transport to prison, Heinrich kept asking about Margaret. Who would continue her treatments? Who would monitor her progress? She was so close to revival. Days away, perhaps. Someone needed to maintain the procedures, or all his work would be wasted. The officers listening to him realized they weren't dealing with a criminal who understood his crimes. They were dealing with someone whose mind had shattered so completely that he genuinely couldn't comprehend why anyone objected to what he had done. The investigation revealed the full scope of Heinrich's descent into madness. 23 children confirmed dead, 6 barely alive, Dozens more who had been used and released, carrying permanent damage. And at the center of it all, a dead woman who had been transformed into a grotesque monument to obsession. Margaret had been dead for over 2 years. Heinrich had kept her body, violated it, desecrated it, and turned it into something that bore no resemblance to the person she had been. The medical community reacted with shock and horror. How had they missed this? How had one of their own descended so far without anyone noticing? The answer was uncomfortable. They hadn't wanted to see it. Heinrich's reputation had made him untouchable. His grief had made him sympathetic. His isolation had seemed natural. They had all contributed to his immunity through their assumptions and their unwillingness to question a colleague's behavior. Vienna demanded justice. But what justice was possible for crimes this extensive, this calculated, this utterly inhuman? Heinrich Volker had destroyed families, murdered children, and desecrated his own wife's remains in pursuit of an impossible goal. How did society punish someone who had committed atrocities that most people couldn't even imagine? The answer would come in the form of a trial that would expose every detail of Heinrich's crimes. But for the families of the victims, for the children who survived, and for a city that had unknowingly harbored a monster, no trial could ever be enough. The damage was permanent. The horror was indelible. And the question that haunted everyone was simple and terrible. How many other respected men were capable of similar atrocities if grief and obsession pushed them far enough? Heinrich Volker's trial began in July 1791 and lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, journalists, and families of victims. The prosecution presented evidence that made even hardened judges pale. Heinrich's journals were read aloud, each entry more disturbing than the last. Surviving children testified when they could, though most were too traumatized to speak. Medical experts explained the procedures Heinrich had performed, their voices shaking with disgust. Heinrich's defense was non-existent because he refused to mount one. He didn't deny any accusations. Instead, he used his time in court to lecture about his theories. He explained his research methodology. He insisted that his work represented the future of medicine. When the judge asked if he felt remorse for the murdered children, Heinrich seemed confused by the question. They had contributed to something greater than themselves. Wasn't that enough? The verdict was unanimous and swift. Guilty on all counts. 23 counts of murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, dozens more charges related to kidnapping, assault, and desecration of human remains. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out immediately. Vienna wanted this monster gone, wanted to erase the stain he had left on their city. But Heinrich's end would prove even more disturbing than his crimes. In the week between sentencing and execution, Heinrich was kept in a cell beneath the courthouse. Guards reported increasingly bizarre behavior. He would spend hours talking to empty air, having conversations with Margaret. He insisted she was waiting for him. She understood his work. She forgave him for failing to complete her resurrection. They would be together soon, he said, in a place where death had no power. On the morning of his execution, guards found Heinrich unconscious in his cell, barely alive. During the night, he had used a smuggled scalpel to perform surgery on himself. The scene was so grotesque that 2 guards resigned rather than describe what they had witnessed. Heinrich had attempted to extract his own organs. He had made crude incisions across his abdomen and chest, apparently trying to remove his heart. The logic, as far as anyone could determine from his incoherent babbling, was that he wanted to transplant his own heart into Margaret. If his love couldn't revive her in life, perhaps it could in death. He had managed to cut deep enough to expose his ribcage before blood loss made him lose consciousness. Medical staff stabilized him enough for execution. They stitched his self-inflicted wounds with crude efficiency. There was dark irony in doctors saving a man's life specifically so he could be legally killed hours later. Heinrich remained barely conscious through the procedure, murmuring about Margaret, about resurrection, about love conquering death. The hanging was scheduled for noon on August 12, 1791. Thousands gathered to watch. Heinrich had to be carried to the gallows, too weak from blood loss to walk. His surgical wounds had reopened, soaking through his clothes. He looked more corpse than man, which some observers noted was fitting for someone obsessed with the dead. As the noose was placed around his neck, Heinrich spoke his final words. They were addressed not to the crowd, not to God, not even to his victims. He looked toward his estate and called out to Margaret. He told her he was coming. He told her they would be together again. He told her he had finally found a way to join her in death since he couldn't bring her back to life. The trapdoor opened. Heinrich's neck snapped cleanly. He died instantly, which many victims' families considered a mercy he didn't deserve. But the horror didn't end with Heinrich's death. Authorities had to decide what to do with Margaret's desecrated remains. The body had been kept as evidence during the trial, stored in a sealed room at the morgue. When officials finally opened the chamber to arrange burial, they found something that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The advanced decomposition, combined with Heinrich's modifications, had created chemical reactions that no one anticipated. The body had swollen to grotesque proportions as gases built up in sealed cavities. The various grafted tissues had decomposed at different rates, creating a patchwork of putrefaction. Organs from different children rotted in her body cavity, creating a toxic soup. The smell was so overpowering that 3 officials passed out before the door could be closed again. The decision was made to burn Margaret's remains without further examination. But when they moved the body to the crematorium, something went catastrophically wrong. The accumulated gases and chemicals in the body created an unexpected reaction with the crematorium's heat. Margaret's corpse essentially exploded, spattering decomposed tissue across the crematorium chamber and onto several workers. The workers who were contaminated developed severe infections. 2 died within a week from blood poisoning. The crematorium had to be thoroughly cleaned and blessed by priests before it could be used again. Even then, workers reported a lingering smell they couldn't eliminate. The crematorium was eventually demolished and rebuilt on a different site. Margaret's ashes, what remained after the disaster, were buried in an unmarked grave far from Vienna. No ceremony, no marker. Just an anonymous hole in the ground for remains that had been so thoroughly violated they barely qualified as human anymore. The Volker estate was seized and demolished. Every building, including the mausoleum, was torn down brick by brick. The grounds were excavated to recover all the buried children. Families who could afford it arranged private burials. The others were interred in a mass grave in the paupers' cemetery with a simple marker: the innocents. May God grant them peace. The surviving children scattered to various institutions and families. Most died young from complications of their injuries. Only 2 lived into adulthood, both carrying physical and psychological scars that defined their entire lives. Neither ever spoke publicly about their experiences. The memories were too traumatic to verbalize. The medical community instituted new oversight procedures, supposedly to prevent similar atrocities. But everyone knew these were largely symbolic. The real lesson of Heinrich Volker was uncomfortable. Respected position, combined with grief and obsession, could transform anyone into a monster. And society's willingness to overlook warning signs in respected individuals made it possible for those monsters to operate freely. Heinrich's medical research was destroyed. Every paper he had written was removed from libraries. His name was stricken from medical society rolls. Vienna tried desperately to erase Dr. Heinrich Volker from history, but the families of his victims couldn't forget. The children who survived couldn't forget, and the city itself couldn't shake the knowledge that for 2 years, one of their most celebrated citizens had been conducting atrocities that defied comprehension. The final bitter irony came years later, when medical historians examined what remained of Heinrich's research notes. His theories about tissue regeneration and blood transfusion were actually scientifically sound. In different circumstances, pursued ethically and rationally, they might have advanced medical science significantly. Heinrich Volker had possessed genuine brilliance. He could have saved thousands of lives through legitimate research. Instead, his obsession with one specific death transformed him into something that killed dozens and traumatized hundreds more. His love for Margaret, which began as genuine devotion, became a disease that consumed not just him, but everyone around him. He turned his wife's corpse into an abomination and murdered children to feed his delusion that death could be reversed through butchery and determination. In the end, Heinrich Völker proved nothing except that the human capacity for horror has no bottom. That grief without limits becomes indistinguishable from hatred. That love, when twisted by obsession, creates more death than any disease. And that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones society respects most, because respect makes them invisible until their crimes become too massive to ignore. Vienna moved on, as cities do. The Völker case became a cautionary tale, then a historical footnote, then a nearly forgotten piece of medical history. But in certain old records carefully archived, the details remain. 23 names of murdered children, 6 names of survivors, and 1 name that represents everything humanity is capable of becoming when love, grief, and scientific curiosity detach completely from empathy. Dr. Heinrich Völker tried to conquer death. Instead, he became its most devoted servant, delivering dozens of innocents to it in pursuit of an impossible resurrection. His legacy isn't medical advancement. It's a reminder that the boundary between healer and murderer is thinner than anyone wants to believe, and crossing it requires nothing more than grief, obsession, and the arrogance to believe that love justifies any atrocity.